Picture this moment. You've finally broken free from the psychological prison they built around you. The narcissist who once held complete control over your emotions, your decisions, your very sense of reality, suddenly realizes something terrifying. You've won. But here's what Carl Jung discovered about this moment that will shock you. And what happens next might be the most dangerous phase you'll ever face. According to Jung, there exists a pivotal moment in every narcissistic relationship dynamic that he termed the recognition of defeat. But here's what Jung discovered that most people don't realize. This moment isn't about the narcissist accepting loss. It's about them recognizing that their primary source of narcissistic supply has achieved something they believed was impossible. You've become psychologically independent. Carl Jung said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But what happens when one person transforms so completely that they're no longer susceptible to psychological manipulation?" Before we dive deeper, if this resonates with your soul's journey, please hit that like button and subscribe for more transformational content. Your support helps this message reach other souls who need to hear it. The narcissist realizes you've won when they can no longer trigger your emotional reactions, make you question your own reality, control your responses through guilt, shame, or fear, or extract the emotional energy they desperately need to maintain their false self. But here's where Jung's insights become truly chilling. Within every human psyche exists what he called the shadow, the collection of repressed, denied, or undeveloped aspects of the personality. For the narcissist, their shadow contains something terrifying, the truth of their own inadequacy, their deep-seated shame, and their fundamental emptiness. When a narcissist realizes they've lost control over their primary supply source, they experience what we now understand as narcissistic injury. But Jung described it as shadow confrontation. The carefully constructed false self begins to crumble, and the shadow emerges with devastating force. Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." For the narcissist, your victory forces them into an unwanted confrontation with their darkness, and they will fight this awareness with everything they have. But there's something even more disturbing that Jung observed about this process. He identified 3 distinct stages that occur when a narcissist realizes their psychological dominance has ended. Understanding these stages could be the difference between maintaining your freedom and getting pulled back into their web of control. Jung discovered that the narcissist's first response is complete disbelief. Their ego cannot accept that someone they viewed as psychologically inferior has gained the upper hand. This triggers what he called compensatory mechanisms, desperate attempts to restore the previous dynamic. They'll test you with increasingly desperate tactics, sudden displays of vulnerability or change, escalated aggression, and blame attempts to recreate past trauma responses, love-bombing behaviors mixed with punishment. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." The narcissist senses you've claimed this privilege, and it terrifies them because it exposes their own inauthenticity. But here's what Jung warned about stage 2 and why it's the most dangerous. When the narcissist can no longer maintain their psychological superiority, they enter what he termed mass shadow projection. Everything they hate about themselves, their emptiness, their shame, their inadequacy, gets projected onto you with unprecedented intensity. This stage is characterized by smear campaigns that seem to come from nowhere. Accusations that mirror their own behavior, exactly attempts to turn others against you, and gaslighting that becomes increasingly desperate and obvious. Jung said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." The narcissist's accusations during this phase are actually a perfect map of their own psychological wounds, but they're too fragmented to see it. And then comes stage 3, what Jung called the point of no return, when a narcissist realizes they've definitively lost their hold over you. they face what he described as psychological death, the complete collapse of their false identity. Jung discovered that this stage manifests in one of two ways: complete withdrawal and narcissistic hibernation, or a final explosive attempt at psychological destruction. He said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." The narcissist faced with this prospect will often choose to destroy rather than accept. This is when they become most dangerous, not because they're strong, but because they have nothing left to lose. Understanding Carl Jung empath dynamics reveals why your victory triggers such an extreme response. Narcissistic personality patterns develop as a defense against profound feelings of inadequacy and shame. The narcissist creates a false self, a grandiose identity that requires constant validation and control over others to maintain. Jung said, "The persona is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society. For the narcissist, this persona is everything. Without it, they believe they are nothing. When you were under their influence, you served as what Jung would call a mirror for their false self. Your emotional reactions, your dependency, your trauma responses, all of this reflected back to them the image of power and control they desperately needed to see. But when you've won, when you've reclaimed your psychological sovereignty, that mirror shatters. Suddenly, they see not a powerful manipulator, but what Jung described as the wounded child beneath the mask. This moment of recognition triggers what he called existential panic, the terror of facing one's true self without defenses. And this is exactly why your victory represents such a threat. Here's what happens in their mind when they realize you've won. Jung said, "Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." The narcissist has spent their entire adult life looking outside for validation, control, and identity. Your psychological freedom forces them to look inside, and what they see terrifies them. According to Jung's analytical psychology, the narcissist's realization triggers several simultaneous psychological processes. The persona crumbles. The carefully constructed mask of superiority begins to dissolve when it no longer has your reactions to sustain it. Shadow material emerges. All the shame, inadequacy, and rage they've repressed comes flooding to the surface. The anima, or animus, rebels. Jung's concept of the inner opposite gender archetype represents the parts of themselves they've rejected. Without your compliance to project onto, they're forced to confront these disowned aspects. Finally, archetypal chaos occurs. The fundamental patterns that govern their psyche, the hero, the victim, the controller, all begin competing for dominance simultaneously. Jung discovered that this internal chaos explains why narcissists often seem to lose their minds when they realize they've lost control. They're literally experiencing what he called psychic fragmentation. But here's the most important thing Jung learned about this process. Narcissists don't just manipulate others. They live in what he would recognize as a distorted reality bubble. They genuinely believe their own lies, their own superiority, their own version of events. Jung called this unconscious identification with the persona. He said, "The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can only be outgrown." When you outgrow your susceptibility to their manipulation, you're not just winning an argument or ending a relationship. You're shattering their entire reality. Here's what Jung observed happens when this reality bubble bursts. Cognitive dissonance overload occurs. Their mind cannot reconcile their self-image with the evidence of your independence. Projection becomes desperate. They frantically try to push their internal chaos onto you, but you're no longer receiving their projections. Reality testing fails. According to Jung, they may begin to question everything not in a healthy way, but in a fragmenting way. The false self dies. What Jung called ego death occurs, but unlike healthy ego death, this happens without the support of a developed, authentic self. This is why Jung warned that the moment of your victory could be the moment of their greatest danger to themselves and others. He discovered something crucial about narcissistic personalities. Their psychological structure is so rigid and defensive that when it breaks, it doesn't bend. It shatters. Unlike healthy individuals who can integrate failure and loss, the narcissist's psyche lacks what Jung called adaptive flexibility. When faced with the collapse of their false self, several dangerous phenomena can occur. Psychotic breaks may happen. Jung observed that some individuals, when faced with the collapse of their false self, may temporarily lose contact with reality entirely. Projective identification intensifies. They may desperately try to merge psychically with others to avoid facing their emptiness, becoming stalkers, or engaging in boundary violations that escalate dangerously. Suicidal or homicidal ideation can emerge. Jung noted that when the false self dies without a true self to replace it, some individuals may prefer literal death to psychological authenticity. Malignant regression occurs. They may regress to earlier developmental stages, becoming childlike in their rage and revenge fantasies. Jung said, "The meeting with oneself is at first the meeting with one's own shadow." For the narcissist, this meeting is so terrifying that they may choose destruction over integration. But here's what Jung discovered about how to protect yourself during this dangerous phase. When you've achieved psychological victory over a narcissist, you're in what he called a position of dangerous strength. You've claimed your authentic power, but this very authenticity can trigger the narcissist's most primitive defenses. Personal development through Jung's lens requires maintaining psychological boundaries. He said, knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. Stay aware of their projection attempts without absorbing them. Avoid the savior complex. There's a temptation to try to help them through their collapse. Jung warned that this is often the false self trying to reassert control through your compassion. Expect escalation. Psychological systems fight hardest just before they transform or die. The narcissist's behavior may become more extreme precisely because they're losing power. Document everything. From a Jungian perspective, the narcissist's desperate acts during this phase reveal their true character more clearly than ever before. This documentation protects you and provides clarity. Most importantly, trust your individuation process. Jung called the journey toward authentic selfhood individuation. Your victory represents successful individuation despite their interference. Trust this process completely. Jung made one more crucial observation about this phase. Narcissistic dynamics don't exist in isolation. They're part of what he called the collective unconscious, the shared psychological patterns that influence entire communities and cultures. When a narcissist realizes they've lost control over you, they often try to mobilize collective unconscious forces against you. Flying monkeys emerge. Jung would recognize these as individuals who unconsciously identify with archetypal patterns like the loyal soldier or the rescuer. They become extensions of the narcissist's will without realizing it. Social manipulation intensifies as the narcissist appeals to collective shadow projections, getting groups to project their own disowned darkness onto you. Institutional abuse may follow as they try to use legal systems, workplaces, or community organizations as weapons, knowing these institutions often unconsciously support narcissistic authority patterns. Jung said, "The individual has always had to struggle not to be overwhelmed by the tribe." When you've won against a narcissist, you're fighting not just them, but unconscious tribal patterns that support their type of psychological dominance. This is why Jung emphasized the importance of what comes next. Your victory over narcissistic manipulation represents what he saw as completion of the hero's journey. the archetypal pattern of growth, challenge, transformation, and return. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." By winning against the narcissist, you've not only reclaimed your authentic self, you've become what Jung called individuated. But he discovered that this completion phase has its own challenges. Integration means you must integrate the lessons learned without becoming cynical or closed off to genuine connection. Wisdom transmission becomes important. According to Jung, those who complete the hero's journey have a responsibility to help others who are still trapped. Continued growth matters because victory doesn't mean stagnation. Jung emphasized that individuation is a lifelong process. Shadow work becomes crucial because, ironically, your victory may reveal aspects of your own shadow that were hidden while you were focused on survival. Jung warned that the greatest danger for the victor is believing the journey is over. He said, "The meeting with oneself is at first the meeting with one's own shadow." Your victory over external manipulation now opens the door to even deeper self-discovery. What Jung observed psychologically, modern neuroscience has confirmed biochemically. According to his understanding of the psyche-soma connection, and the narcissist's realization of defeat triggers massive neurochemical changes. Jung anticipated that the narcissist's brain during this phase would be flooded with stress hormones that impair rational thinking, activation of primitive brain centers associated with survival, disruption of normal emotional regulation systems, and heightened aggression and fear responses. He said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." From a neurochemical perspective, the narcissist's brain is literally designed to avoid this acceptance, which is why their reactions can seem so extreme and irrational. But here's what Jung understood about the victim's neurochemical changes. According to his holistic understanding of human psychology, your victory over narcissistic manipulation creates profound positive changes, not just in your psyche, but in your entire being. Successful resistance to narcissistic control triggers increased production of confidence-building neurotransmitters, strengthened neural pathways associated with self-trust, improved stress response and emotional regulation, and enhanced pattern recognition and boundary-setting abilities. Jung said, "Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart." Victory over narcissistic manipulation literally clears the neurochemical fog that kept you confused and reactive. This is why Jung emphasized that your victory isn't just personal. It's archetypal, representing humanity's potential to choose authenticity over manipulation, truth over illusion, individuation over enmeshment. Here's what Jung discovered that might surprise you. Your victory over the narcissist isn't the end of your transformation. It's the beginning of your real life. When someone successfully individuates and becomes authentically themselves despite narcissistic interference, they often discover enhanced intuition. Jung believed that overcoming manipulation develops what he called the transcendent function, the ability to navigate complex psychological situations with wisdom. Deeper relationships become possible because, having experienced false connection, you now recognize and attract authentic relationships. Creative expression often emerges as Jung observed that individuation frequently unlocks previously suppressed creative and spiritual capacities. Service to others becomes natural. Many people who've won against narcissistic manipulation feel called to help others who are still trapped. Jung said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." You've done this terrifying work, and the rewards are just beginning to unfold. Here's the ultimate truth that Jung discovered about narcissistic relationships. They serve an unconscious but crucial function in human psychological development. The narcissist enters your life not as a random predator, but as what he called an unconscious teacher, someone whose manipulation forces you to develop psychological muscles you never knew you had. Jung said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." Your victory over the narcissist represents more than escape. It represents the integration of your own disowned power, your own capacity for discernment, your own ability to choose yourself over others' comfort. The narcissist's realization that you've won is really their recognition that they've completed their unconscious function in your life. They pushed you until you became unmanipulatable, and in doing so, they facilitated your individuation journey. Jung would say this is why they're so enraged when they realize you've won. Unconsciously, they know their purpose in your life is complete, and they're no longer needed for your growth. Carl Jung empath and personal development principles reveal that this transformation follows an alchemical pattern. Jung understood human development as an alchemical process where base psychological materials are transformed into psychological gold. Your journey from narcissistic victim to individuated being follows this same pattern. The narcissist's manipulation initially activated what Jung called your false self, a defensive persona constructed to survive psychological assault. But through the crucible of suffering and awareness, this false self eventually dissolves, revealing the authentic gold beneath. The narcissist realizes you've won when they can no longer trigger your false self because your false self no longer exists. You've become what Jung called individuated, whole, authentic, and psychologically sovereign. This isn't merely recovery. It's a fundamental reorganization of your psychological structure that renders you immune to manipulation tactics that once devastated you. According to Jung, this transformation reverberates through the collective unconscious. Your victory doesn't occur in isolation. It inspires others to claim their own authenticity, creating ripple effects of individuation that extend far beyond your personal situation. Jung believed that when one person achieves genuine individuation, it activates archetypal patterns of liberation in others. Your authentic presence becomes a catalyst, unconsciously giving others permission to question their own false selves, to challenge their own manipulative relationships, and to embark on their own journey towards psychological wholeness. This is why narcissists react with such fury to your transformation. They're not just losing their source of supply. They're witnessing something that threatens their entire worldview, proof that authentic selfhood is possible, that their manipulative reality isn't the only option, and that genuine strength exists beyond their comprehension. Jung discovered that this level of psychological development is rare and precious. Most people remain trapped in what he called collective identities, unconscious patterns of behavior that keep them psychologically dependent and manipulable. By achieving individuation despite narcissistic interference, you've not only won your personal freedom, you've contributed to the evolution of human consciousness itself. The process requires extraordinary courage because it demands facing what Jung termed the shadow, all the rejected, denied, and suppressed aspects of yourself that the narcissist exploited. True victory means integrating these shadow elements without being destroyed by them, transforming psychological lead into gold through conscious awareness and acceptance. Your willingness to feel your authentic emotions, to trust your perceptions despite gaslighting, and to value your truth over external approval represents a level of psychological bravery that Jung considered heroic. You've chosen the difficult path of self-knowledge over the comfortable path of self-deception. The narcissist's rage at your victory is really their unconscious recognition that they've witnessed something extraordinary, a human being choosing truth over illusion, authenticity over approval, individuation over enmeshment. Their fury isn't just about losing control. It's about confronting their own psychological poverty in the presence of your newfound richness. Jung said, "Your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it." Your victory over the narcissist represents the dismantling of these barriers and the beginning of a life lived from your authentic center. The barriers weren't originally yours. They were installed by narcissistic manipulation through shame, fear, and false beliefs about your worth. The narcissist convinced you that love was conditional, that your value depended on their approval, and that your perceptions couldn't be trusted. These barriers protected you from further abuse, but also separated you from genuine connection. Individuation means recognizing these barriers for what they are. Protective mechanisms that serve their purpose, but now limit your capacity for authentic relationship. As you dismantle them through conscious work, you discover that love isn't something you must earn or perform for. It's something you naturally embody when you're being authentically yourself. This is what happens when the narcissist realizes you've won. They're forced to confront not just their own emptiness, but your fullness. Not just their manipulation, but your truth. Not just their false self, but your authentic being. And in that confrontation lies the seed of humanity's greatest hope, that authenticity will always eventually triumph over manipulation. Your victory is not just personal. It's archetypal, eternal, and absolutely unstoppable. You've activated what Jung called the self, that deeper center of personality that exists beyond ego manipulation and social conditioning. This self cannot be destroyed, controlled, or diminished by external forces because it draws its power from the deepest sources of psychological life. Jung believed that the self naturally moves toward wholeness and truth, and that any system based on deception and manipulation ultimately cannot prevail against it. Your individuation represents this eternal principle in action, and the triumph of authentic being over false manipulation of truth, over illusion of integration, over fragmentation. If this resonates with your experience, if you recognize these patterns in your own life, remember this: your capacity to recognize narcissistic manipulation is itself evidence that you're already on the path to victory. The very fact that you can see the game means you're no longer completely trapped in it. Your individuation journey has already begun, and narcissistic manipulation, no matter how sophisticated, cannot ultimately prevent a soul determined to become authentic. Jung taught that the psyche naturally moves toward healing and wholeness when given the opportunity. Your growing awareness, your increasing ability to trust your perceptions, and your courage to value your own experience over external validation are all signs that this natural healing process is already underway. Your victory isn't just possible. According to Jung's understanding of human psychological development, it's inevitable. The self will not be denied indefinitely, and your authentic nature will ultimately assert itself regardless of the obstacles placed in its path. The narcissist's power was always an illusion sustained by your willingness to believe in it. As you individuate, that illusion dissolves, and what remains is the unshakable foundation of your authentic self, whole, sovereign, and free. But there's something deeper Jung discovered that we must explore. The moment when the narcissist realizes you've won triggers what he called the final metamorphosis, not just in you, but in the entire psychological field between you. Jung understood that when an empath achieves true individuation, they don't simply escape the narcissist's influence. They transform the very nature of the archetypal pattern itself. You become what he termed the individuated healer, someone who has integrated both light and shadow, who can see manipulation without being manipulated, who can offer compassion without losing boundaries. This transformation is so profound that it actually changes the narcissist's archetypal role in your life. They shift from being the devouring mother or tyrannical father to becoming what Jung called the completed teacher. Their destructive purpose fulfilled their unconscious gift delivered. But here's what Jung warned about this phase. The newly individuated person faces what he called the hero's temptation, the desire to use their hard-won psychological insight to rescue others who are still trapped in narcissistic dynamics. Jung observed that many people who successfully escape narcissistic manipulation immediately want to return to save others. But he cautioned that this impulse often comes from an unhealed part of the psyche, the savior complex that made them vulnerable to narcissistic manipulation in the first place. True integration means accepting that not everyone is ready for the journey you've completed. Some people are still learning lessons that can only be taught through their own encounters with manipulation and control. Your role isn't to rescue them, but to serve as what Jung called a lighthouse, a beacon of possibility for those ready to navigate their own way to shore. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect of your victory to accept. After experiencing the profound relief and empowerment of psychological freedom, watching others suffer in dynamics you now understand can feel unbearable. But Jung discovered that premature intervention often reinforces the very patterns you're trying to break. The person still enmeshed with a narcissist isn't ready to hear what you know. They haven't developed the psychological muscles necessary to use that information constructively. Giving someone insight before they've earned it through their own suffering often creates what Jung called ungrounded knowledge, information that cannot be properly integrated because it wasn't lived into being. Instead, Jung taught that your most powerful tool is simply being authentically yourself. When you operate from your individuated center, you naturally challenge the unconscious assumptions that keep narcissistic dynamics in place. You don't need to preach or teach. Your presence alone offers a different model of how to exist in the world. People who are ready to question their own patterns will be drawn to your energy. They'll ask the right questions at the right time. And when they do, you'll know because their questions will arise from genuine readiness rather than desperate seeking. This is the difference between the wounded healer and the individuated healer. The wounded healer tries to heal others to avoid facing their own remaining shadows. The individuated healer heals from a place of wholeness, offering what is needed when it's genuinely requested without attachment to outcome. As you embody this new way of being, something extraordinary happens in your relationship with the narcissist who once controlled you. They begin to experience what Jung called archetypal completion. Their unconscious purpose in your life, to force you toward individuation, has been fulfilled. This creates a strange phenomenon Jung observed in many such relationships. The narcissist may actually become less interested in controlling you, not because they've changed fundamentally, but because you no longer serve their archetypal function. You've graduated from being their unconscious teacher, just as they've graduated from being yours. Some narcissists at this stage may attempt what Jung called the final gambit, a last desperate attempt to re-establish control. But these efforts feel hollow and performative because the psychological field that once sustained them has dissolved. Others may simply fade from your life, moving on to find new sources of supply who can serve the purpose you once served. This isn't cruel or unusual. It's simply the natural completion of an archetypal cycle. The deepest freedom comes when you can observe these patterns with what Jung called compassionate detachment. You understand the narcissist's behavior without taking it personally. You see their manipulation without feeling compelled to counter it. You recognize their pain without feeling responsible to heal it. This state of consciousness Jung described as the psychological adult. Someone who has integrated their own shadow sufficiently to see others clearly without projection or reaction. You can be in relationship with difficult people when necessary, while maintaining your psychological sovereignty. But perhaps most importantly, you can finally engage in truly intimate relationships, because you're no longer seeking someone to complete you or validate your worth. You come to relationships as a whole person, seeking to share that wholeness, rather than as a wounded person seeking to be healed. Jung believed that individual individuation contributes to what he called the collective evolution of consciousness. Every person who breaks free from unconscious patterns makes it slightly easier for the next person to do the same. Your victory over narcissistic manipulation isn't just personal healing. It's a contribution to humanity's psychological development. You've proven that authentic selfhood can triumph over even sophisticated manipulation. You've demonstrated that truth is ultimately more powerful than illusion. This is why Jung emphasized that the individuated person has a responsibility, not just to maintain their own psychological health, but to live as an example of what's possible when someone chooses consciousness over unconsciousness, authenticity over performance, integration over fragmentation. But Jung also warned against what he called individuation inflation, the belief that achieving psychological victory means the work is complete. True individuation is a lifelong process of continuing to discover and integrate previously unconscious aspects of the self. Your victory over the narcissist represents one major completion in your psychological development, but it also opens the door to new levels of growth and awareness. Having learned to navigate one form of shadow projection, you become more sensitive to subtler forms of unconscious manipulation, including your own. The goal isn't to become invulnerable to all psychological influence, but to remain conscious of when you're being influenced and to choose your responses from a place of awareness rather than reactivity. What does this look like in daily life? You find yourself naturally setting boundaries without anger or explanation. You can listen to others' problems without feeling compelled to fix them. You can receive criticism without defending or attacking. You can offer help without attachment to whether it's accepted. Perhaps most significantly, you can be alone without loneliness and in relationship without losing yourself. You've discovered what Jung called the marriage of opposites within. The integration of masculine and feminine aspects, light and shadow, individual will, and collective responsibility. This internal marriage makes external relationships possible in a way they never were before. Instead of seeking your other half, you seek to share your wholeness. Instead of trying to complete someone else, you invite them to discover their own completeness. The ultimate teaching of the narcissist-empath dynamic, according to Jung, is that love without consciousness becomes possession, and consciousness without love becomes isolation. The journey toward individuation teaches you to hold both, to love consciously and to remain conscious within love. This is what the narcissist could never understand. They experience love as ownership and consciousness as threat. But you've learned through your trials that true love requires the freedom to choose, and genuine consciousness includes the capacity for authentic connection. Your victory isn't over the narcissist. It's the victory of integrated consciousness over unconscious compulsion of chosen love, over desperate attachment of authentic self-expression, over performative adaptation. And in achieving this victory, you've not only freed yourself, you've contributed to the liberation of human consciousness itself. Every person who chooses truth over illusion makes truth more accessible to everyone else. Modern neuroscience has validated what Jung intuited about the profound changes that occur when someone breaks free from narcissistic manipulation. Your brain literally rewires itself during the individuation process. The neural pathways that once automatically responded to manipulation tactics begin to weaken, while new pathways associated with self-trust and boundary setting strengthen. Jung anticipated that this neuroplasticity would manifest in specific ways. Your amygdala, the brain's alarm system, learns to distinguish between genuine threats and manufactured drama. Your prefrontal cortex develops enhanced pattern recognition, allowing you to spot manipulation attempts before they can take hold. Most significantly, your nervous system learns to maintain what Jung would call centered responsiveness, rather than reactive defensiveness. You can remain calm in the presence of chaos, clear in the midst of confusion, and grounded when others are trying to destabilize you. This neurological transformation explains why many people report that after winning their battle with a narcissist, they feel fundamentally different, not just psychologically, but physically. They sleep better, think more clearly, and feel more energetic. The constant hypervigilance required to navigate narcissistic manipulation was exhausting your nervous system. Freedom from that burden allows your body's natural healing processes to resume. Jung understood individuation as not merely a psychological process, but a spiritual one. When you break free from narcissistic control, you're not just healing psychological wounds, you're reclaiming your soul's autonomy. The narcissist didn't just manipulate your emotions and thoughts. They attempted to possess your spiritual essence, to make your inner life serve their outer needs. Your victory represents what Jung called the return of the soul to itself. You've reclaimed your right to your own inner experiences, your own dreams, your own spiritual insights. No one else can tell you what you feel, what you know, or what you've experienced. This spiritual sovereignty manifests in practical ways. You may find yourself drawn to new forms of creative expression, spiritual practices, or philosophical inquiries that were suppressed during your time under narcissistic influence. Your dreams become more vivid and meaningful. Your intuition sharpens dramatically. Jung observed that people who complete the individuation journey often develop what he called religious function, not necessarily adherence to organized religion, but a natural sense of connection to something greater than the ego. This connection provides unshakable grounding that no external manipulation can disturb. However, Jung warned that even victory has its shadow side. Some people who escape narcissistic manipulation develop what he termed survivor's pride, a subtle superiority complex that can isolate them from others who haven't completed the same journey. The danger lies in believing that your hard-won psychological insights make you fundamentally better than those still trapped in unconscious patterns. This belief, while understandable given what you've survived, can become its own form of inflation. Jung emphasized that true wisdom includes humility about the ongoing nature of psychological work. Your victory over one form of unconscious manipulation doesn't make you immune to all psychological blind spots. In fact, it may reveal new areas where your consciousness needs development. The individuated person learns to hold their achievements lightly, recognizing them as milestones in an ongoing journey, rather than final destinations. This prevents the shadow of spiritual pride from undermining the very freedom you've worked so hard to achieve. One of the most profound changes Jung observed in people who've completed this journey is their capacity for authentic intimacy. Having learned to maintain your psychological boundaries while remaining emotionally open, you can now engage in relationships without losing yourself or trying to control others. This creates a paradox that confuses many people still operating from wounded patterns. You become simultaneously more independent and more capable of genuine interdependence. You need less from others emotionally, which allows you to give more freely. You're less afraid of being alone, which makes you better company when you choose to be with others. Your relationships begin to operate on what Jung called the principle of voluntary association. People choose to be with you because they genuinely enjoy your company, not because they need something from you or because you need something from them. This shift can be disorienting for people in your life who are accustomed to the old dynamics. Some may feel rejected by your newfound independence, interpreting your healthy boundaries as coldness. Others may be inspired by your authenticity to examine their own patterns. Jung discovered that maintaining psychological freedom requires ongoing practice. The patterns that made you vulnerable to narcissistic manipulation didn't develop overnight, and they don't disappear permanently after one breakthrough. They require conscious attention and regular integration. This practice involves what Jung called active imagination. Regularly checking in with your unconscious through dreams, meditation, journaling, or other introspective practices. You learn to recognize early warning signs when old patterns are trying to reassert themselves. Perhaps most importantly, you develop what Jung termed the capacity for conscious suffering. This doesn't mean seeking out pain. but rather choosing to feel difficult emotions fully rather than avoiding them through unconscious patterns like people-pleasing, controlling others, or addictive behaviors. One of the most valuable gifts of your journey is enhanced discernment, the ability to quickly assess people's psychological health and motivations. This isn't about becoming judgmental or paranoid, but about protecting your energy and investing it wisely. Jung observed that people who've survived narcissistic manipulation often develop an almost supernatural ability to detect inauthenticity, manipulation, and hidden agendas. This skill serves them well in all areas of life: professional, personal, and spiritual. However, Jung warned against using this discernment as a weapon or a way to feel superior to others. The goal is protection and wise investment of energy, not judgment or control. As you stabilize in your new psychological freedom, you naturally begin creating new patterns that reflect your authentic values rather than survival strategies. You might find yourself gravitating toward different types of people, activities, and environments. This process requires patience because your nervous system needs time to fully trust that the old threats are gone. You may catch yourself preparing for manipulation that never comes, or being surprised by genuine kindness and respect from others. Jung emphasized that this recalibration is normal and necessary. Your psyche is learning to operate from a position of strength rather than defense, and this requires practice in low-stakes situations before it becomes automatic. Perhaps the most beautiful aspect of your transformation is how it continues to ripple outward in ways you may never fully know. Your children, if you have them, grow up seeing a model of authentic self-expression and healthy boundaries. Your friends witness someone who chose truth over comfort and growth over stagnation. Colleagues experience your unshakable center during crises. Strangers encounter someone who radiates genuine confidence rather than defensive bravado. Each of these interactions plants seeds that may bloom in ways you'll never see, but that contribute to the collective healing Jung envisioned. Jung took what he called the long view of psychological healing. Individual transformation, while personally crucial, serves the larger purpose of human consciousness evolution. Every person who chooses awareness over unconsciousness, authenticity over performance, and love over fear contributes to humanity's psychological maturation. Your victory over narcissistic manipulation represents one thread in this vast tapestry of collective healing. By refusing to remain trapped in unconscious patterns, you've helped make those patterns less powerful for everyone. This perspective can provide comfort during difficult moments in your ongoing journey. When you feel lonely in your growth, when others don't understand your choices, when the path of consciousness seems harder than unconscious conformity, remember that you're part of something much larger than your individual story. Jung's final insight about this process is that integration never truly ends. Each life stage brings new opportunities to apply your hard-won wisdom in fresh ways. New relationships, career changes, health challenges, and spiritual developments all require the ongoing application of your individuation skills. But this isn't a burden. It's the joy of conscious living. Having tasted the freedom that comes from psychological sovereignty, you wouldn't choose unconsciousness even if it were possible. The ongoing work of integration becomes not a chore, but a creative expression of your commitment to authentic existence. Your story doesn't end with victory over the narcissist. It begins there. Everything that follows is the unfolding of a life lived from your authentic center, contributing your unique gifts to the world, while continuing to grow in wisdom and compassion. This is Jung's ultimate vision for human psychological development: individuals who have faced their shadows, integrated their wounds, and emerged as conscious contributors to the collective evolution of human consciousness. Your journey from narcissistic manipulation to psychological freedom represents this vision in action. Thank you for joining me on this deep exploration of Jung's insights into the transformative power of psychological sovereignty. If this resonates with your journey, remember that your continued growth and authentic presence are gifts not just to yourself, but to the collective awakening of human consciousness. Subscribe to continue exploring these profound psychological truths and share this understanding with those ready to embrace their own individuation journey.